Sara and Emily, welcome. Emily Smith and Sara Reed, assistant professors of interior design. I'm so glad to welcome you to Research Rewind. Thank you for taking the time to be with us. And I'm going to hand it off to you because I know you have some things to share with us, and then we'll have time to have an exchange after your presentation.
Well, first of all, thank you for giving us this opportunity. Emily and I wanted to take a few minutes just to give you an overview of our Patterns of Place project and basically what led to that lecture that we gave in the spring of 2021, and then how our work has advanced into phases, 3 separate phases since then. So what we're going to give you is an overview of our phase 1, and it focused on the patterns of Virginia, both natural and human-made. And in this phase, we invited 7 designers and academics from across the state to document patterns in their specific regions. So I think we can move forward with the next slide.
And those participants were from the fields of graphic design, textile design, architecture, interior design, and history. So here you can see how we were interested at the time in sort of looking at how there may be specific motifs and patterns that appear across the state, and how those would provide us with insight into the culture, people, time, place. And in 2018, we received an exploratory research grant that allowed us to really start to formalize some of the work that had started in cross-course experiments leading up to that. So Sara and I both teach in the interior design department, and we're both drawn to interdisciplinary work. And so some of those kind of cross-course projects were, that was the fuel that led to the idea, well, let's make something bigger out of this. And so here you can see we looked at the coastal plains region, the Piedmont region, and then the mountain region. And out of our 7 participants, we had participants focused on each region.
Here you can see the 3 big primary research questions that we posed to our participants. What patterns are explicit to certain communities? How do we create a deeper understanding of place and identity through pattern investigations? And what are the processes used to identify, document, and analyze regional patterns? And so then below, you get a sense, those are just 5 examples. As we said, we had 7 who participated, but these are 5 that joined us in this faculty lecture series and shared their insights with us in a kind of dialogue. So you can see a variety of document patterns with each person's unique perspective shaped by their education, maybe their gender or racial identity, their profession. These all informed their choices. So that you can see John Malinowski's graphic design, Camden Whitehead in watercolor, Mimi Sadler, who used this interesting digital figure ground map that had been used in the city master plan, and then used PowerPoint to kind of find the essential elements of that to tell stories about communities around Richmond. Kevin Jones used drone photography, and then Helene Renard used both hand drawing and digital photography. So as Emily mentioned in the timeline, those opportunities for collaboration across courses, initially that really was rooted in textile research and understanding patterns, narratives, materiality, how something is made. Those really came through, textile was kind of the material that we were looking at most holistically, but this really gave us an opportunity to look at pattern in really different ways. And so I'll pass it on to Emily for this next slide.
Well, and the early conversations that we had with phase 1, they involved sort of what are the constants and what are the variables? How prescriptive do we want to be? When you have 7 participants, especially designers and artists, we acknowledged and understood that they all had ways in which they work. And so we had a very wide open, there were very few constants or sort of controls or constraints, and a lot of opportunity. And so what that yielded was predominantly photography. The majority of the images were photos, but it wasn't a significant, by majority, it wasn't that far off in terms of almost being half and half. We had a lot of hand-drawn, a lot of sort of, maybe not hand-drawn, but stenciled. There were a lot of different processes that found their way into the project. And it was really exciting to sort of see how there were certain similarities and then certain differences between the different regions. And then how, like Sara was saying, the lens that the participant used, not only did it tell us about the place, but it told us about them as a participant in the project. When we presented at the faculty lecture series, we created these juxtapositions because as part of our analysis, we wanted to understand what are the themes that are emerging from close to 90 different sort of documented motifs or patterns, 90 different observations. And so we had a number of slides like this where we were able to sort of pull from the different regions, and we weren't just looking within the silo of the mountain region or the coastal plains. It was more kind of across the state. How do we look at images that help us to start to pull themes that speak to Virginia as a place?
We were particularly interested, for instance, I think if you look at the image number 4 on your screen by Kevin Jones, who used drone photography, you can see a railroad along a river, and it's capturing both those organic and inorganic forms, calling attention to the way that that human-made interventions are cutting through the landscape in some way. And so that's something that we more broadly were questioning, as what is the role of a designer in terms of intervening or integrating into the landscape. And so we're interested here in materiality, in construction choices that are very much of a place, and both the natural elements and the human elements here.
So as we wrapped up phase 1, I think one of the things that we started to question was, are we actually documenting patterns? Are we documenting motifs? You know, at the end of a research phase, it's a great opportunity to sort of step back and ask, did what we set out to do end up being what we did? And so I think at the end of phase 1, what we started to realize was that it's less of an index of patterns and it's more of an index of methodologies. And so if we're exploring or considering how we can understand places through these methods of observation and analysis, there's value in that. There's value in coming up with or developing methodologies or processes that we can use for a number of different reasons. And so I think I mean, Sara, I don't want to speak for you, but I think we kind of struggled sometimes with, like, do we change the name of the project? Do we change the course? But then what we found was that in the sort of analysis phase and in preparing for the faculty lecture series, we were realizing that there were patterns that these motifs or these observations were speaking to, and it still felt relevant under sort of an umbrella, but that the methodology aspect of it was really interesting to us, and that would be perhaps what we focused on in phase 2.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, and Emily also notes here in this particular slide, the faculty lecture series was actually really helpful for us in terms of helping us to, and I'm sure most of those of you in the audience, when you've had to put together like a paper for a panel, you know that process, that synthesis of and analyzing your data is really helpful. And in this case, doing it with a team of people, I mean, obviously Emily and I were the leads in this, but working with these 7 participants was just was really valuable for us. Several of them are professors at other universities, and so just giving us a glimpse into the ways in which you can you can look at place in different ways. That was valuable.
So that led us to phase 2, which was brewing simultaneously in the spring of 2021, which is when we gave our faculty lecture series. I think that preparing for that lecture series and that panel discussion was very helpful in us getting to a point where we had sort of a sense of where we would want to go next. And coincidentally, one of our panelists, Camden Whitehead, who was a professor in the interior design department here at VCUarts, he was leading the MOB studio, which is an interdisciplinary studio that is at 205 East Broad Street, and it involves students, VCU students from a number of different departments. And so Sara and I started talking with Camden about how we could keep the spirit of phase one, which was to examine a place, invite participants into a process, and then apply different constraints to yield observations that could help us understand that place better. The place that we chose was Richmond's 2nd Street. The participants, we had 15 students that were enrolled in the MOB studio during the fall 2021 semester. And when looking at 2nd Street, we started to think about a specific path, which was between the Gilpin Court community and then the American Civil War Museum on the James River.
In terms of how did phase one inform phase two? Emily spoke to that idea of using a similar methodology in terms of dividing up the 2nd Street into these regions in a way to understand place in more of a microcosm within an urban landscape. The other thing that really shifted is in terms of saying, okay, collectively, we're going to walk this path together, and we're going to, so there might be kind of natural organic conversations that happen along that path, and very different from an isolated experience. And we're walking the exact same path. And they were using their phones to document initially, their to photograph, and then we asked them to, and I think we can get to this, maybe can we skip forward to that? Thank you. It shows us walking and then coming back, and each individual student basically mapping out their individual paths through first photography, and then taking some of those images, kind of editing those down into charcoal drawings that they felt were the most significant along that path, using 8x8 white paper. And so you have kind of the observation level, the documentation, and then the analysis that comes in with deciding how are you going to make those choices about, what this path might mean to you in that narrative. So I think that was really, we're still in that phase now, Emily and I, in terms of taking all of those almost 600, I think, both the photographs and the charcoal drawings, and analyzing them in the same way that we did with phase one, in terms of trying to derive certain themes and create juxtapositions in a similar vein, a similar method. But we can share some of those. I think we have an image of that.
We do. Before we go to the next slide, I just wanted to share that, I think all of us can relate. Sometimes we're really sort of in it. And I think for me, this was such a fun moment. I loved, this is MOB Studio here, these two images on the left. And, it's hard to find physical space that we can use for long periods of time to visually sit amongst the data or the work that we're doing. And so much of what we do is digital now. And I think that this, for me, changed the way that I think about how the process is working for us and how we want to work on future phases potentially. So here on the top, these are all of the photos. We printed them. Every photo that students took on I think it was 4x4 inch was the scale. And so they are organized in a grid, and the rows are each student, each participant. So there are 15 rows. And then they were organized from the Gilpin Court community, which was the start of our path, to the Civil War Museum. So this is meant to be a visual mapping of the experience to where they could go from seeing their own lens to seeing alongside everybody else's. And the fascinating thing to me was that you started to see the gaps, like where along the walk did we not photograph?
Mm-hmm.
Where were there lots of photographs? And to realize that what was an individual experience in some ways, like, okay, what am I going to choose to photograph or document? To find that there were sort of common ways of approaching that process was interesting. And there was a lot of discussion and reflection that by having this, we were able to have, that if we hadn't physically pinned up like this, I think it would have perhaps not been visible. It wouldn't have necessarily been apparent. So this was on one side of the mob studio. And then on the other side, we had this, which the logic was the same in terms of the pinup, 15 rows. The path was going from left to right. And then these are those charcoal drawings like Sara was describing. And then here, we're able to start to see how this is one of the participants, 2 of their photos, and then their subsequent charcoal drawings. This was a different participant, 2 of their photos and the charcoal drawings. And you'll notice how they were creating their charcoal drawings, not from sight, but from photograph. And so this person is looking at this photograph as they're creating the charcoal drawing. But what I love is how the omission or the sort of subtractive here, like what is captured, what's not captured, here, what's captured, what's not captured. You gain a different understanding of place by looking at this image versus this image. And now we are in the thick of creating juxtapositions like this for every single pairing. And like Sara said, we have over 600.
We also neglected to mention that one of the outcomes from that initial phase was a website, which is really exciting, but we also want to shift the website over to really talk about this as a larger project and as different phases and different aspects of different, potential methodologies for studying place. And so I think that that's kind of pushing us to create these kinds of juxtapositions and analyses so that we can then share those on our website. Yeah, and then the next phase, we're hoping to take a very similar methodology that we've created for the Second Street in terms of understanding place through a path and creating a Patterns of Place workshop for students at the VCUQ campus. So fingers crossed, we have some grant applications out that would take us to Doha in the fall to collaborate with VCUQ faculty, some of whom we've been Zooming with, who are really interested. And in fact, Astrid Kinzinger from VCUQ graphic design, she gave a faculty lecture, I think, was it in January of this year? I can't remember.
Right.
Yeah, and she and her work is very we have a similar ethos, I think, in our work. So having that opportunity through the faculty lecture series to understand her project and opportunities for collaboration has been really exciting for us.
And I'll drop into the chat the website that we created. We hired a local group called Campfire and Company to help us create this website that I just dropped into the chat. And that was a way for us to connect with other people, sort of provide a channel for sharing the work. And we hope to be updating it in the next year with phase 2.
Fantastic. Wow, thanks you guys so much. That was really interesting. And I have a lot of, I wrote down strange little notes, but I love this idea of the index of methodologies that you cited that seems to be coming forward for you from this stage. And definitely, I think I'm interested in hearing more about the revelation of mapping when you have multiple lens, like multiple people's maps laid out, in this beautiful physical way where you've printed everything, you put it on a wall, because that in itself is like its own map. It's like when you're standing in the national park and the map is in front of you and you're like on the place and in the map at the same time. So I don't know. I don't know if I have a particular question about that. I'm just kind of sitting with the idea of this overlayering of people's maps, what you know, like what everybody seems to notice or not notice on a journey, and the documentation of that. And then I wonder if you could speak to, like, when you see these commonalities or you see gaps, what questions then come forward for you in those, either of those spaces? Overlap or gap.
Yeah. I mean, what stands out to me in terms of the gaps that seemed to really happen as we were approaching, or we were going through the downtown area where there's I'm trying to think of what the building is called. It's the old Ethel building, that as you're going toward Tredegar and the Civil War Museum. And so it's a little bit more open. There's some green space, but it's not necessarily public space. And I think some of the students were struggling with, okay, what is the built environment of this moment and how it's shifted? And I don't know how to document that. And it's a little more uncomfortable from where I was coming from, where it was much more dense, and it was moved from more residential to mixed use. So it was a little bit more fuzzy. And I think that those moments of discomfort can be really helpful to kind of sit in that. So I think one thing that's really exciting, I think, for us is we've created this Eastern Shore Study Away program that we're going on for the second year. And part of that is a week on the Eastern Shore and a week in Richmond. And I'm really excited about the week in Richmond and kind of thinking about being tourists in our own city. And we're going to be making that same path on 2nd Street. And I think for Emily and I, it's going to be a great opportunity for us to do that another time, right? That idea of that repetitive nature of, like, what are these students noticing? And can we perhaps give them more prompts in terms of, like, looking at certain relationships that could activate it in a different way.
Yeah, I think that the whole sort of idea of it being more about the methodologies than even sort of what's being documented sometimes, I think that it's all valuable, but I find myself coming from a design background where we do site studies when we start projects to understand, where is this building, what is the site. There's an immediate site and then a broader site. And I mean, we've all seen the buildings that, it's like, that could be in Tucson, Arizona, it could be in Richmond, it could be, and it doesn't have any connection at all. There's no real understanding of the site beyond, is it buildable? And so I think that for me, I really appreciate how a lot of the conversations that emerge from, whether it's phase 1 or phase 2, have to do with people, or they have to do with ecosystems, or they have to do with really complicated histories that sometimes maybe we shy away from thinking, oh, that's not something I have to navigate because I'm hired to do this or that. And so I think I'm just really excited about how it slows us down a bit. I think methodologies, when they work well, perhaps that's what they're meant to do, is that they create sort of a process that you can follow that isn't just about getting to an endpoint, it's about embracing a process.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you sort of just answered this, but I was thinking, like, how has your relationship to place evolved through this project? And whether that's here or the sites you visited, or even the sites that you are in yourselves every day, like, do you notice a change in your own relationships with place?
I think so.
Mhm.
Yeah. I think about Sara and I, we walked the slave trail last week, and we started at Ann Caro's Landing, and then we were walking along the river. And so we only walked a portion of it, but the conversations that we're having while we're walking, it's not necessarily like I'm trying to do it, but I think that they certainly reflect now 5 or 6 years of conversations about these types of things. And I think it's found its way into my teaching, certainly, in how I have students approach site studies. So I definitely feel a bit more like I have a methodology, I have a process that I employ and that I'm able to give them that I think is really helpful, and sort of figuring out where are the really prescriptive aspects, and then how do I allow them to sort of also co-create something.
Yeah, that's a good point. I also do it in my courses since I'm teaching design history, and really having them do these neighborhood walkabouts where they're walking through neighborhoods around campus and trying to help them to understand, densities and scale and so forth. But the other thing that I think came up, and something that we're building on in terms of this methodology, is starting it with a little bit more of a thoughtfulness around positionality and being an outsider into a neighborhood or into a place. And that's something that we're building on, that we're also, I think, looking forward to adding that depth.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So, well, I know we have 3 minutes left. This is just, I mean, you're in phase 2, but I'm interested in, like, is your curiosity pointing towards, other directions that we haven't heard about yet? Like, what are you looking ahead towards? And Doha being a primary, but what else? What else?
Well, we are hoping to also be in Sicily next summer. I've led a program with Hilary Fail, who's in the Craft and Material Studies department. We co-created and co-led a program before COVID. And so we're hoping to go back. And Sara and we don't want to jump too far ahead yet, but we're sort of wondering if once we develop this program in Doha, if that would be a great next step. But like Sara was saying, it's challenging because we also want to carve out time to work with, like, we don't want to just drop in a methodology to a place that is unfamiliar to us. And so it's good to have a partner there that we can co-create the methodology with, or the sort of workshop with. But that's the hope, is that hopefully we'll be in Sicily next summer.
Yeah, that's glorious.
Sounds good, doesn't it?
Yeah. And maybe one last question. You spoke a bit about, your students' experience with this work, and you've incorporated it into your teaching in some ways. Has there been anything that's come forward from your students in terms of their own learning or their own surprises when they engage in this process with you?
Well, oh, you go ahead, Emily, if you had something on the tip of your tongue.
Well, there was a student an MFA student that was involved in that phase 2 project, whose thesis project was focused on the Gilpin Court community and the idea of what is home. And that person has stayed involved with us in a number of ways. And I think they provided us with some really great feedback, and just their participation, the questions they were asking and the things they were observing. It was helpful for us to sort of examine our own lenses and our own sort of biases. And so I think that was incredibly important.
Yeah. That's great. Sara, anything to add?
Yeah, I was actually going to mention that same student. That was very poignant. But I would say overall, I think that that students, I think they took to the project pretty well, the Second Street project, in terms of, it felt really interesting to look at Richmond like askew when you think of like Broad Street and some of these Franklin and so forth, and just shift it. What is that relationship then between Gilpin and the water and the river? And, seeing that sense of that distance. And so, just kind of just shifting us a bit, I think was really mind-opening for a lot of us, all of us.
Great. Well, thank you both so much. I really appreciate your time and participation, and look forward to hearing more as your research continues.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, I'm going to bring on our next panelist, Jonathan Molina-Garcia. Jonathan, I'm going to move you into the panelist space. And for those just joining, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us for Research Rewind, VCUarts faculty talking about their work and past projects and current projects and what their trajectory might be. I'm going to welcome Jonathan Molina-Garcia as Assistant Professor of Photography and Film. Sorry, I'm doing several things at one time. And I'm so glad to see you, Jonathan. And I'm going to let you take it away because I know you have some slides to start off, and then we'll be able to talk once you've presented.
Great, thank you, Lee. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Is this coming in? Okay, and then you're seeing my one slide, right?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, so I only have the one slide, but I think I want to cover quite a bit in just this the short time that I have. So the way that I was thinking of structuring just this conversation was just to kind of summarize the event of the lecture itself. So for those of you who attended the talk, or if you are familiar, I know this is recorded, but the talk itself functioned as a work of art, as a project, in the style of a kind of performance lecture. And so this was my first sort of effort or attempt at kind of doing this, where I took on kind of this persona. And so the thumbnail you're seeing here in the middle is sort of the getup that I had kind of donned to deliver these words. So the project or the lecture when I delivered the talk in 2021 was at the time I was calling it Rocks Are Magic, because I was thinking a lot about the kinds of mystical and spiritual function of existing with the earth and with a kind of like ecological companionship. And so what happens to artists, but also to the mind when we are kind of confronted directly with sight. Moving forward, and I think after I delivered the talk, I've gone through several phases of, I think, re-articulating the project, and now I am calling it Big Bend Border Blues to refer to the national park that I have been working with, Big Bend National Park, which is a sprawling sort of desert landscape that sits on the border of the U.S. Texas-Mexico border. And I love alliteration, so that's really just why I changed the title. But also because I wanted to capture this idea of border blues, right? Of a kind of depressive longing or a depressive thinking around the border. And so the content of the project and the talk itself really dealt with tragedy, but really a tragedy that sits on a kind of national scale. And fairly recent. So a lot of the events that I'm looking at are coming from kind of contemporary American, calling it here American terrorism. So mass shootings, for example, here on the right is kind of the final image that I showed at the talk, which is a 360 still photograph of a kind of panoramic view of the Pulse site, the Pulse bar in Orlando, Florida, where in 2016 a shooter went in and killed 49 people. So the talk really kind of I think was bookended both by Pulse at the end, and then also the work and the kinds of site investigations that I'm doing at Big Bend, where I'm considering and thinking about the kinds of unmarked deaths that have occurred at border crossings. And so many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the kinds of political stories and news stories that we've heard about, child detention centers, but also the number of uncounted and missing children, right? Not to mention also sort of adult life. So in in that pursuit of, I think, this kind of content, my objective in creating a spectacle of sort of a delivery of this project was to synthesize these sort of what I'm kind of calling these divorced art and epistemic fields to construct an aesthetics of pain. And so when I talk about kind of divorced epistemics, and the idea of synthesizing various knowledge fields is something that is, I think, quite urgent and critical for me as someone that is, I am working in photography, but my practice is much more interdisciplinary and very expansive of various kind of lens-based medias. So, and I'm also a writer, and I think my interest really is also in synthesizing different kinds of like philosophical theories. So I lined out here three. One, post-colonial theory, critical indigeneity, because critical indigeneity is also very much thinking about the kinds of geopolitical circumstances around past traumas. Two, photography and video game design. So thinking really about the possibilities for immersive lens-based imagery. And then three, which is really what feels like the most like illegitimate, is esoteric kind of mysticism and Buddhist tantric practices. And I can kind of go more into that, but generally, I think when I'm talking about that, I'm referring to both sort of transcendental kind of meditative practices that allow us to feel our ancestors, but also to feel the specificity of sight and of the present moment. And so this talk, I would say, in this project, or actually just to refer to the talk itself, because I think when I gave the talk, it really, it kind of functioned like it's a odd form of like CBT, like a cognitive behavioral therapy, where I was, listening to myself. I entered into a different kind of like cognitive space. And much of that kind of happened, I think, through a kind of the creation of this performance, this persona. So I was speaking not as myself, as Jonathan or as Jay, but as this kind of fictional identity that I've since sort of discarded. So this identity was only really used for this talk. And so the talk was, for me, functions along with these three kind of markers, where it's both, or one, a fugue state, where I was attempting to envelop my audience into this kinds of atmospheric space that was deeply emotive and emotional. So when I was talking, I found myself really getting angry, and my voice really started to rise and shake, and and when I went into it, I thought I was going to cry, or I thought it was going to be a much more kind of like sort of peaceful or tranquil kind of talk, but I think there's a lot there for, I think, artists to consider in terms of like how we use both our vocalization and then also our images to kind of create a kind of entire atmosphere and ecology. To a time travel experiment, and this is something that I think I've been thinking a lot about, is just how artists and an artist talk can distort time by both contracting and expanding it. So one of the, I think, frequent comments that I get when people hear my lectures is that, oh, that didn't feel like an hour, or that didn't feel like 45 minutes, right? And I think that's like I cherish that, and that's actually a very kind of deliberate design, is that I'm trying to sort of alter our sense of time. And then three, this is the last thing I'll say before I end, is that, so as I've been mentioning, is that this project and this talk also kind of function as a performance lecture, where it's delivered in the style of an anonymous queer shaman. And I think some of that shamanism and the kinds of histories of shamanism are directly then tied into the kinds of esoteric kind of tantric practices that I'm researching for this project.
Thank you, Jonathan. That was fascinating. So I'd love, let's see. Yeah, maybe the question around benefit or impact, like what's unfolding for you or more broadly from this work as you move along.
I can answer this in a kind of a multifold way. It's both personal and professional. I mean, I think the project, it's allowing a kind of, and this might sound maybe surprising or shocking because of the kind of content that I'm dealing with, is that I'm actually experiencing levels of like euphoria,
Hmm.
both gender and professional and otherwise, and I think that is something quite tricky to talk about, because I think most people would assume that an artist that's dealing with events or very recent events, right? I'm looking at Pulse, and these are events that are really from the past 10 years, that it would sort of saddle me, that it would saddle the artist with melancholia, or that it would like re-traumatize me. I think so. Even when I gave the lecture in 2021, one of the questions that I asked, or that someone asked me, was, how do you take care of yourself? How do you recover? And as much as I sort of respect that question, I think it's very critical actually for artists to practice more communal moments of like self-care and recovery. And I do practice that. I do sort of reset, and this work does sort of demand that I go slow.
Mhm.
All that being said, I think that, and I called myself in that talk, I called myself a seamstress of sadness,
Mm.
as someone that is like spending a kind of minutia of time building something and entering a kind of cognitive, mental, physical, embodied space of learning and of outputting all of this out, right? I think my maybe a perhaps hypothesis, and I mean other thinkers are, I think, also sort of running through these theories or speculation, is that also personal suffering is not just also only for the individual.
Yeah.
Or another way of saying this, I saw this on TikTok the other day. It was like, this is a comment that someone said, like, what's good for the bee is good for the beehive.
Yeah.
Right. And I think I do this to really create a kind of like ripple effect,
Mhm.
right? So that these moments are, one, not forgotten, but also to like be aware that of how we treat departed life, right? That departed life is still life. It is still with us.
Mhm.
And I think, to speak to my interest in Buddhism, within like Tibetan Buddhism, you have, if you look at these kind of diagrams of samsara, these kind of cyclical drawings and paintings of the cosmos, one of the realms is the realm of hungry ghosts.
Yes.
So, and I think that it's such a kind of poignant kind of term and concept to think about, right? It's like that our ghosts and that our ancestors and that our spiritual kind of ancestors are hungry, that they're eager, and that they want something, that they still desire things. And so in that sense, I don't feel like traumatized by my projects. I feel held by them.
Yeah, there's a way in which this makes me think of, well, a couple things, but one is like with really intense body work, it can be quite painful. But if you lean into the pain, usually that's going to take
Mm,
you to a deeper place of release or, processing through whatever is
mm,
held. Um,
yes. I think surrender is so important.
yeah. And the way, and this, the way I often think of artists, in our culture as like, it's almost like a lung, like this is where we process, what's wrong
Mm,
a lot of the time. I mean, sometimes it's what's beautiful but also like pain. And
mm.
so that, I don't know, that just,
That's,
yeah,
yeah, and that's such a beautiful kind of embodied uh image you gave me, right? The lung.
yeah,
And I think that that's also, you had a question here about like what your process looks like, or what
yeah.
investigation looks like. And I think for artists, it's like, I mean, it's not like we're running lab experiments, right?
Mhm.
We're not quantifying things through data. Some of us are. Some of our projects deal with kind of direct empirical observations, but I think for a lot of makers, a lot of people who are working with their hands, it's like our understanding of our own work and the discoveries we make is through embodied knowledge.
Yeah,
And I think the metaphor of the lung is actually quite beautiful, because this is really how we survive, is through the simple kind of locality of a breath, right? Of
yeah,
breathing in and breathing out. That you take something in, but like it has to come out eventually. You have
right,
to breathe, otherwise we die.
right.
And I think even Claudia Rankine has a moment, I think, in Citizen, an American Lyric, where she says like, something about like the measure of every life is a breath. Like it's not, and even though it may not be a lot, like that's what we have. Um, so yeah.
Yeah, that's actually, there's in the Buddhist meditative practice of Tonglen, where you're supposed to, I think you hold one side of your nose, but you breathe in suffering, you take it in, and then you breathe out.
Mm,
You filter it out and put it back out.
oh,
Yeah,
that's gorgeous.
yeah.
Yes, the filter, right? And also speaking about the filter makes me think about the interface,
Mhm.
or the work of art also as a kind of like screen
Yeah,
that screens out, but also
yes,
exhibits, that shows.
right. It's revelatory. I mean, I think about this with our students, because you can watch cultural pain filter through in students' work, and in ways big and small, but it seems like you've in this where I know I'm not in my regular questions, but I'm just responding in the
That's right.
moment. But that you've something about that persona in your presentation. It's almost like you turn yourself into a portal, or yeah, this kind of like
Mm,
passageway. Yeah, all of these metaphors of transference or
mm,
permeability. Yeah, it's
the avatar. I
yeah,
mean, yeah,
yeah.
I think we also, I mean, it's funny because I mean, I've been making these suits, or I've thinking really a lot about wearables, and I struggled to really identify what it was that I was making. I was unsure about what was it? Was it fashion design?
Mm,
Was I making costumes?
yeah.
And I think your comment made me think of this kind of inquiry that I had, and ultimately I think I've settled with the idea of a spiritual armament,
Mm,
right? The uniform.
yeah.
The uniform is also deeply, deeply designed. I mean, you look at this is kind of another area of research, is like also looking into camouflage design. And this is why the suit that I was wearing was sort of modeled after US military kind of camouflage
Mhm,
patterns.
mhm.
And so with the intention that I really sort of wanted to sort of decenter that, the kind of perhaps maybe some of the kind of romanticization of like fashion, but to really think about clothing as uniform, as a protective barrier.
Yeah, yeah. And a support.
Mhm. Exoskeletons.
Right. Yes,
Yeah.
exoskeleton. Right. Okay, well, let's see. We talked about process. How about how this work or if this work intersects with your teaching and or how students, sort of do or can engage with your research work?
Mm. Yes, yes, yes. Excellent question. The first thing actually that I wrote down was doing tarot readings in class. Which I've done it twice. I did it in the fall twice with two classes that I had, undergrads and grad students, where this was like the icebreaker. You know, it's something professors will go around the room and you're like, okay, tell me something interesting about you. And I just went and pulled cards, yeah, for these students. And I don't think I'm gonna do that again. I think actually this was quite heavy
Yeah.
because it's too accurate. And then, like, you know, with one of my students, it was like, oh, Queen of Swords, did you recently go through a breakup? And she had, right? So it was like almost too fast. It was like a level of intimacy, but it was like too immediate.
Yeah.
So now, and I did it in this room, but it was like more optional. I was like, hey, if you guys want to like meet me and talk to me one-on-one, I'll do these readings. And partly I do that because I am very, very much interested, as I was saying, it's like in bridging these like divorced knowledge fields. And I think tarot is something that is has entered the mainstream, has become kind of like a kind of popular parlor trick, you know. But I also do it just to kind of open this door to a deeper kind of imagination. I mean, tarot is so much about like faith.
Yeah.
Right? You have to kind of trust that you're going to get an image, and really simply, I mean, it's like trust and coincidence. To maybe repeat an earlier statement is to trust in surrender. And how do we sort of do that as an artist when I think so many of us are conditioned to think about art along the lines of economy and profit, right? So I mean, I ran a project this semester with my sophomores where I was asking them to produce anti-terrorist fictions using AI image generation, right? I'm demented. It's so funny doing
That's
this.
amazing.
And I had one student who really opposed the project because they had a lot of negative perspectives on AI, right? And there are so many, and which I think is quite telling of just how quickly these like phobias and these fears and these kind of internalized insecurities are built into the system, that we are so threatened by a machinic companion,
Right.
when we've had photography now for like a couple centuries.
Right. Right.
So I think, but it was like a really beautiful moment. I think hearing the student kind of articulate their grievances or their misgivings was such a wonderful kind of teaching moment to continue talking. I think about these things that we're talking about is how do we surrender? How do we build an artistic practice that goes beyond the profit motive, that goes beyond sales, right? And which is very important. We can kind of talk about it, but I think, you know, if there's any lack, it's not really the lack of economy that we have in art school. It's like the lack, I think, is that there's almost like no awareness of what art can do to the spirit. And I don't mean that at all in a religious sense, right? But like, how can it heal us? How can it heal communities? And that's almost like, it's like you are like dumbfounded. Like, how do you? It's like no one knows what that looks like.
Right. Right. And there's almost like in the compressed sort of environment in academia, how do you make space for that, which is not bounded by time, or you know, that demands time and space, like and a kind of expansiveness in yeah. There's a question from Micah that might connect a little bit right here. He says, if fugue refers to loss of identity, does it follow that you apprehend time and time travel as bound to or by identity? can read it again if you.
No, I understand it. I think actually, if it does refer to a loss of identity, then the apprehension of time then would not be bound by an identity, but by something else. It's a different frame of reference. I think, I mean, transcendental meditation is a lot about the refusal or negating or emptying out of the mind, right? So, I mean, even a friend sent me this like YouTube video of like a meditation guide, and one of the mantras that they start you off is with this it's a two-part statement that goes, I am not the body, I am not even the mind. And you hear this and you're like hearing this for like 10 minutes, and I can understand like the idea of like, I am not the body. It's like, yeah, okay, I've gone through, I understand what that would be, but then, you know, like, what would it mean to say to someone, an individual, like, you are not your mind?
Yeah.
Right. And I think that's the time travel can happen. The apprehension of time can actually function quite prolifically once we let go of that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hmm.
I'm reading a book about time. Have you read The Order of Time by Carlo Rovelli? He's a physicist.
No, I don't.
It's
Thank
like
you
a
for giving me that.
layperson's guide to time. Anyway, and it's extraordinary. It
Oh,
resonates with me.
incredible.
Yeah, is like he speaks at a certain point about we think of the world as events and things, but things are actually events. Like a table is an event in time. It's a boring one, sort of, you know, it's very static for a while, but it is
Yes.
entirely static.
Yes.
So when you
And-
look around and consider the world as all events, it connected very much. It sounded very Buddhist to me.
Exactly. Oh, 100%. I
Yeah.
mean, I think this is also explains why, like, Willem Flusser is writing History of the Devil and looking both at quantum physics and Eastern spirituality. So I think that's quite beautiful to think about how, you know, even the body, the mind, consciousness is not a person, but an event.
An event, yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
Wow.
Okay, we have like 2 minutes. Just maybe let's talk a little bit about like new pathways or where your curiosity is pointed right now, looking forward.
Oh gosh, so many where to go. I want to keep doing performance lectures. I want to have this sort of platform. I am so close to making a TikTok. The talk I gave was tailor-made really for these like sound bites,
Yeah.
you know. I want to expand that kind of poetic prose. I want to finish my Brown Sadness book, which I've been kind of working for a couple of years. I want to, I'm actually thinking about applying to the electrical engineering department.
Wow.
And just becoming an electrical engineer, because I think it's not, you know, because I think there's a lot of non-artists who have this idea of art as illegitimate, right? It's like this is kind of our constant, our boogeyman. And I want to go back to the STEM fields. I mean, I had such a love for math when I was a teenager.
Mhm.
And then I sort of let go because I think academia and knowledge in general can be so over specialized and so partisan. And I think it's like I'm trying to return to the hard sciences and the maths, really not to make art legitimate, but to make the sciences like illegitimate.
Hmm.
Because I want to corrupt them. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, that's like a whole nother. We have to have another talk because there's
Yes.
a lot
yes.
there. Yeah. Well, we're at time, and I'm so grateful to you for participating. Thank you for sharing and for this conversation. It's really magical to talk with you and to hear about your work. So please keep us posted.
Thank you. Yeah, watch out
your-
for that TikTok account. It's coming.
Yeah, and your infiltration of the world of STEM. So yeah, go forth.
Thank you.
All right. If you're just joining, thanks so much for being with us. My name is Lee Marshall, and I am Director of Research for the School of the Arts. And we're gonna next talk with Noah Simblist, who is Associate Professor of Painting and Printmaking. And I'm going to welcome Noah. I'm gonna spotlight you.
Okay, thanks so much, Lee. And that was so great to hear Jay just now. I'm gonna share my screen. Thanks again, Lee, for inviting me. And I'm gonna follow your instructions and try to recap what my talk was in the fall, which was kind of an overview of a few projects from the past few years. As I mentioned then, my background is as an artist, but really for the last 15 years, I've worked as a curator, as a writer, and as an educator in ways that have often kind of overlapped. So I'm going to talk about a set of 5 projects very quickly. One is called Commonwealth, an exhibition, and then some texts, another exhibition leading up to talking a little bit more in the conversation about some new projects. So Commonwealth was a project that was an investigation of the very term Commonwealth, something that Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Puerto Rico all share. When Virginia and Pennsylvania were established in the 18th century, the idea was to refer to a model of government that was about the common good as opposed to the good of the king or the good of empire. But in 1952, when Puerto Rico was established, a commonwealth was a phrase that became a sign for it being a colony of the United States. So what we were really interested in was an exhibition that was going to be in 3 places that was really talking about the term and what it could mean. So it was a collaboration. Like a lot of my work, it involved multiple people, multiple organizations, multiple places. And most importantly, the ICA in Philadelphia, together with the ICA here at VCU, and Beta Local in Puerto Rico. So it started as a kind of research process, working with students. I taught this class with Stephanie Smith. Then we had this kind of open, more public engagement where we called it Summer Sessions Commonwealth at the ICA, which took over the first floor galleries. It was designed by a team that was based in Bogota and New York. And the idea was to have a flexible space with colored curtain walls that could host performances, workshops, and lectures. It was really conceived of as a public form of learning. Each week had a theme like natural resources. The walls of the gallery were filled with texts and traces from these workshops. Another section was called focused on the built environment. And here you can see a session leader that we brought in, Marshall Brown. We invited urban planners to think about our community through charrettes, about a parcel of land near Gilpin Court run by the Maggie Walker Community Land Trust. We toured the Virginia Capitol, we did walking tours, and it eventually resulted in an exhibition with new commissions by 10 artists. So it was originally supposed to open in fall of 2020 in all 3 places, but as the pandemic came upon us in the spring and summer of 2020, we decided to retool it. I'm actually always happy to have an excuse to talk about this project because it had a more minimal audience than it was originally intended to. So the only exhibition site really was in Richmond since San Juan was under absolute lockdown and Philadelphia made it really difficult. But for the ICA, one thing that we started to think about was how we could have an exhibition both inside and outside the museum. So we had a bunch of projects that were murals, like this one on the left by Firle Baez, the one on the right by Monica Rodriguez. we had this community project by Jerome Chavez, Carolina Caicedo, Tanya Lukin Linklater, Sharon Hayes, Elisa Diaz, who's a local Richmonder, originally from Puerto Rico, and we filmed this movement work for a camera at this former tobacco factory here in Richmond. We worked with Dr. T on this project together with Ram Bhagat on something called the Conciliation Project, an amazing project that Dr. T and Ram Bhagat have worked on for a long time. We invited this LGBTQ organization, Southerners on New Ground, or SONG, to do a projection on the outside of the ICA. There was a publication at the end of it that kind of collated a number of commission texts. And we had something called Tools for Uncertainty, which were these little monikers that were thought of as a kind of vocabulary for us to think about this term Commonwealth. A side project that came out of this was a book called Artists in Residence that was thinking about asking artists to imagine that they're in their household and sheltering in place during a global pandemic, and what would you do? So we had these 50 artists that have short instructions for how to shelter in place. We obviously know how to shelter in place, but here's some more options for the future, the next time there's a global pandemic. So another project that I talked about was this book about Tanya Bruguera's The Francis Effect. So this is a project I worked with her in 2014 and the book published in 2022. It was a performance in the guise of a political campaign to ask Pope Francis to grant all stateless people citizenship in Vatican City. So we worked with the Guggenheim in New York and the Yerba Buena Center and the ICLA in Los Angeles. And the book was basically structured around the project, looking at its history of its relationship to history of activism, its relationship to borders and globalization with an essay by Saskia Sassen, and then an historian of religion, Nicholas Terpstra, talked about the history of the church in relationship to immigration. So as I mentioned, this is her in the front of the Guggenheim in Los Angeles. This was in the context of my former position at SMU in Dallas. And similar to Commonwealth, it really was an extension of ways of thinking about the overlap between an educational environment and a kind of curatorial project. In the last spring, I organized a show called Conjunctions and Disjunctions at Black Ground in Cali, Colombia, that is a cultural organization there that's focused on the African diaspora, and I invited all either current or former VCU students to participate in the show who had some relationship to the African diaspora. I have this relationship with Beatriz. She's a former colleague at SMU, and she's originally from Cali and basically quit her job to start this organization. So I wanted to come visit her and see what it was all about, but also to bring something with me. So bringing literally a suitcase of art. She has very little funding. I used mostly miles to get there. So it was mostly printed work or works on video. So it was a very DIY, low budget show. But the thing that was really remarkable was basically at the sort of the Black community within Cali, which Beatrice works with, was really interested in thinking about a kind of global comparative ways of thinking about the Black experience in the United States that a lot of the artists whose work I was showing was speaking about. So some of the artists include Larissa Rogers, Luis Vasquez, Gino Amobi, Brian Castro, whose project on the bottom right was also part of a project at the ICA, Lucchesa, Branford Verismo, Sandy Williams, Malcolm Peacock, Dea Guy Basson. And lastly, as a kind of coda to that, Bea and I worked on an essay that was looking at, it was called Insurgent Political Theater, Subjects in Revolt in Colombia and Palestine. And much of my work prior to coming here to VCU had to do with art and politics in Israel-Palestine. And we were in dialogue during the spring, summer of 21, where there was multiple uprisings that were happening in Palestine and in Colombia. And we were just interested in the relationships that existed between the two, how there even was a kind of choreography of the way that the press images started to look, the way that the army, the military in both places would actually deal with protesters, like this idea of the water cannon, but also inventive, creative ways that protesters and activists found ways to inhabit the streets in new ways. So in Colombia, for instance, there was a group of queer protesters who were interested in voguing and dancing as a kind of political disruption. And one of the things that's really fascinating is that, like, we were writing this in real time. The protests happened, and then eventually there was an election, which led to a very progressive government coming to the fore in Colombia, which meant that this work actually did something, which is really powerful. And finally, I just have this essay that came out actually since I did my lecture about this artist Alia Farid, called Water Holds a Poetics of Relation. It was online and then eventually published through Burnaway and this reader. And it really focuses on her use of water as an artist who goes back and forth between Puerto Rico and Kuwait, two radically different places, but her personal story kind of links her between those two places, and her work follows through from that.
Yeah, fantastic. Oh, I see 2 questions. Let me see if they're new. No, okay. Maybe, okay, so I know I sent, I have this list of questions, and I'm really interested in, like, thinking about the work of curation and the way, you just shared, like, so much that, but I'm interested in the accumulation of knowledge for you
Mm-hmm.
through this work, like,
Yeah.
what you kind of accumulate through each round of a project and then carry forward, and as it build over time.
Yeah. I was thinking about that. Well, one thing about the work of Alia Farid that I was interested in was, she's from Puerto Rico. She was a former director of Beta Local, this organization that was a participant in Commonwealth. And so, we shared networks connected to that, but also she's an artist who works in the Middle East, an area that I've also had, like, this deep connection to. So in some ways, like, I have accidents of my own story. When I did a PhD in Austin about art and politics in Israel, Palestine, and Lebanon, but the main art history, there was a huge Middle Eastern studies program, but not a lot of contemporary art history in relationship to the Middle East. And so most of my comparative examples had to do with the tremendous resources around art from Latin America and the Caribbean. So I kind of had to learn kind of by necessity, but also by proximity, because it's a border state, that points south in a lot of ways, of how to think comparatively between two areas of the global south. Like, I had to do that through my own experience. And then sort of finding this artist that, by the nature of her own biography, has also tried to do that. So sometimes I find, like, I look for things that both mirror my own background, but also further hold the potential to further my understanding of something that I've kind of happened upon already.
Yeah, that's great. And then it really does become this kind of this knowledge web, right? Because different light up
Exactly. Yeah. I
inputs.
feel like that's my process generally is, and it's what I find to be most generative is like the building of networks.
Yeah,
Yeah, putting things together.
yeah. Seeing connections where, you know, yeah. So what benefits or impacts are do you see unfolding from any of these projects over time?
Yeah, one of the things I, learned from working with Tanya for many years is she has this concept called art utile, or useful art, and she has a very rigorous set of criteria for what makes something useful
Yeah.
as an artwork. So it's something I think about often, like the question of the Francis effect, like how were we able to impact any conversation around immigration, or even with the notion of Commonwealth, like, to sort of ask some questions around like the original intention of the term and whether we live it
Yeah,
inside of that term.
yeah,
Um, but I think that I'm a real believer in like the power of conversation to not just like describe something, but actually to embody something. Like that the form of conversation built on a kind of mutuality can potentially create that um, that seed of possibility of it growing from that intention, and I think, and if one can sort of embed really difficult conversations that most people try to avoid in that intention, then I feel like that holds the potential. I feel like I'd have to do some kind of like accounting of each project to go through like which one really has had real world impact, but that's at least its intention.
yeah. Yeah, I'm thinking about having just talked with Jay about sort of the artist as, as this membrane or this kind of processing body, but
Yeah,
also then a project like and that leans into pain,
yeah,
right? And these projects obviously are doing that as well.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, I feel like um I think of this moment, the moment when I decided to kind of switch from being an artist to working as a kind of critic curator was uh, 2007. There was this artist, Yael Bartana, an Israeli artist now based in Berlin, who had made this work called Summer Camp that was about this a building camp that was rebuilding Palestinian homes in the West Bank that had been destroyed by the Israeli authorities, and it's this group of activists who like live on a building site for 2 weeks. And I lived with them in order to, and worked with them in order to eventually write an essay about her work, but through the experience of this building camp. And one of the things that I found really energizing was like how, if confronted with something that feels so urgent, meaning like it's potentially difficult, but also the urgency doesn't even give you time to think, is this good or bad? There's an urgency to it anyway, where one has to simply act. That's, I think the action of activism is like that kind of response rate. And I'm fascinated by um, that territory, like that territory of action.
Yeah, and right. And so that makes me wonder then about preparedness.
Yeah.
What, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I'm the kind of person who over prepares but then generally kind of leaves it behind. Do you know? And, like
Right.
so that I can improvise based on that knowledge. Do you know?
Right.
Yeah, that's my process.
Yeah. Yeah.
In a nutshell.
So there's lots of research and there's lots of like accumulating, and
Right.
then the thing that, in the moment you rely on what you've built, but you don't
Right.
have notes in front of you necessarily.
Exactly. And it's like that idea of the formal conversation is to be open to listening to others, to things I don't know.
Yeah.
But also like listening to myself speak out loud the things I do know. Do you know? And then realizing sometimes like it doesn't, it's like comedians like, you know, researching a set, like sometimes it just doesn't land. You're like,
Yeah.
oh, I'm glad I knew that. But I
And
think
I didn't.
good.
Yes. Or I didn't know I knew that
Oh, that too.
until I spoke
That's
it.
the wonderful moment.
Yeah, that's the good one, right? Okay.
That's the good one.
Right. Well, how about could you talk a bit about how this work informs your teaching or intersects with,
Sure.
how your students intersect with this work?
Sure. So as I mentioned, the Commonwealth class, it was really important to actually literally teach a class that was
Right.
about the research. And it was so early on, it was kind of bringing students into that process. So, so we're not sure what this project's about. It's about this term. It could be this thing. And I found it was really exciting, Larissa Rogers, that artist who graduated from our program, who just graduated from UCLA with an MFA, who was in that show in Cali that I organized. She was in that class, and just be able to like think out loud, like collectively, not just us, but with students also to think through an idea, I found really helpful. Again, it's sort of thinking about the classroom space as a space for that's a similar kind of thinking out loud, right?
Yeah.
Like where we all come with something, like, and it's not just that we're the accumulation of our knowledge in that space, that knowledge is the preparedness for us to actually improvise
Yes.
around a difficult question, and I feel like that's how I try to set up not all my teaching, but it's always there to some degree.
Yeah. So that's like the generation of new knowledge via connection. Like
Exactly.
right. Yeah.
It's the only thing that feels good.
Right. Right. I mean, that's actually how it works. Like anyway. Yeah. Okay, well, so where are you headed? Like, where's your curiosity pointing you now?
Yeah. The two biggest projects are this triennial that I'm working on. It's another project at the ICA with Dominic Wilsden, the director, and Sara Rifke, who's the chief curator. So we're working on essentially an exhibition project that will focus on the intersection between art and education, that will open kind of over the course of 24-25. As you know, like we're hoping to find different ways for VCUarts to connect, including a symposium. There'll be a publication at the end. And again, like similar to Commonwealth, I think the idea is that there's both this kind of educational resonance within VCU, like within a structured environment of the university, but also kind of public education, thinking out loud with various communities within the city of Richmond. But it's also drawing on like histories of alternative forms of education globally that the three of us have had connections to, but also new ones. So that's one project. And then another one that I just found out yesterday, I made this foundation grant for, is that I can't technically name yet, is a project that is based on a fairground that Oscar Niemeyer, who was this kind of the national architect of Brazil, designed in Tripoli, Lebanon, and it was supposed to open in 1975, but 1975 was also the first year of the civil war that lasted 15 years in Lebanon. And so it never opened officially. It's unfinished, and it becomes like this skeleton of the hubris of the utopian aspirations of modernism, both for like, but thinking about these two areas, Lebanon and Brazil, that have both struggled a lot, even to this day, about as nations, but also hold enormous potential for carrying things to the future. The tagline that's on the Brazilian flag is Ordem e Progresso, like order and progress. And there was this coup last year after the election that happened in Brasilia, the capital, and Brasilia was designed by Oscar Niemeyer. So if anyone saw like news footage in January that was of this coup that was modeled on the January 6th insurrection.
Oh yeah.
So thousands and thousands of people storming through these beautiful modernist buildings that look like something out of a book, but they are the capital of Brazil. And this, interestingly, it's like a really different architectural model than the United States, which was like thinking back towards classicism, you know, but like Brazil was always about the future. So anyway, this project, I'm working with a curator named Susie Halajian in LA. And the idea is to commission a group of artists to make work about this site and have it be exhibited in Lebanon and in Brazil and in the United States.
What's the timeline? Do you have, or do
Well,
you?
the next year, I think, is going to be research. We still need to, that's what the grant was for, was just the research portion. You know, I was lucky enough to get a faculty research grant for the same project. So those things together will help us to kind of get some partners and hopefully have it not open the same time as the triennial.
Right. That's great. Well, congratulations on the
Thanks.
unnamed grant.
Thanks.
Maybe because we have just a couple minutes left. Could you talk? So what does that research look like, just for folks to think about, like research in curation? What is that process like?
For me, I would say it is it forms its own like network too. Like it's not a straight line. It involves travel, it involves conversations with people, it involves reading, it involves watching movies, reading art press. Like it's a kind of like activated way of looking not just towards the present, but thinking about like through lines that are implied historically, both, you know, sort of past and potential futures. Yeah.
So this, right, it's kind of like you have to imbibe as much as possible, and then digest also.
I know. I know. Sometimes I feel sorry for, it's like shared screen of my mind is a little disconcerting, but but it feels good to me.
Yeah. That's fantastic. It's exciting, Noah. Thank you so much. This has been a great conversation, and I really appreciate like the way in which your work is, you know, the crystallography, the sort of way that you know the work of curation is about other people's work, but there is a creative, you know, propulsion or momentum to it that's necessary to kind of see and bring together, you know, these elements into a space.
Yeah, at the end of the day, I see teaching and curating as very, very similar, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you.
Yeah,
And
thank you.
yeah, absolutely. And keep us posted, please.
I promise.
Yeah, okay, good. All right. Welcome, everyone, to Research Rewind with VCUarts. My name is Lee Marshall, and I'm Director of Research for VCUarts, and really glad to welcome Trebien Pollard to the space today. All right, Trey, you made it.
Hello, I am so sorry about that. Something about my computer wouldn't let me log in, so I'm on my phone.
Okay, here you are on your phone. So you probably don't need to share screen.
I don't. I'm hoping I can remember what, because everything was on my phone, but I'm good. I'll be
Okay.
fine.
Well, I'm going to turn it over to you, and then to give a recap, a little talk, and then I'll be excited to talk with you after.
Totally.
Okay.
It's great to be here. Hello, I am Trebien Pollard. I am an assistant professor in dance and choreography. I presented a lecture entitled Black as Is, a performative journey through craft and consciousness. The beginning of it started with a little, this text that I wrote. And so today I'm gonna read a lot of the text that I've been writing. Imagine a world where freedom is defined as the legislation of existence. A world where freedom shows up as violence, restraint, and enclosures. Imagine a world where freedom is synonymous with oppression, injustice, and death. A world where constraint and negation are marks of a life lived and lost. Carry these feelings with you, hold on to them, wear them as armor, adornment, weight, trauma. Now let it go. I'd like to consider a non-existence, disappearance of things in relation, emancipation of things into nothingness. That was the beginning premise of where I started with the project, the lecture, and then we decided to move through some other texts that I had been writing throughout the pandemic and even before the pandemic. This next piece is about seeing. There is this radical resistance to that which is seen and not seen and not seen. But it's the possibility of seeing and seeing the possibility of what it means to be seen and not seen and not seen, as is of with a thing. What is it to be with a thing that is no thing, but something more than, less than, more than, less, more than, a veiled recognition of the unrecognizable, sizable monolith myth that shifts between scenes of subjectivity and a suffering that knows no salvation, only the restoration of good old boys, nationalists. The sons of grand wizards gathered on the stairs of the state capitol, and night clans standing with shotguns in hand, and a man shoots a boy because he suspects he's up to no good. He suspects he's up to no good, no good, no good, no good, no good, no. What are the markers of goodness? The quality and the state of being good, virtuous, righteous. No life is to be lived here in fear of its own existence, existing in and of itself as a life, less lived, less loved, less valued. What is the value of a life? Whether it be to live or to die, to live is to die, and to die is to live a life in and out of relation to the forgotten, the lost, the left behind, the should have been, not yet, never was a life. And now we're going to kind of move into some of the newer material that I created after the lecture series. This is some more character-driven stuff. They thought they had me. They thought they had me. That's right. That's right. That's right. They thought they had me, but they didn't have me. Nah, they didn't have me. This he that I be he, me he be. They didn't have me, because I be dipping and dodging, click, click, boom, deflect, deflect, deflect. I be dipping and dodging, click, click, boom, deflect, deflect, deflect. I like doing that one. And then the last one is this longer one that I probably won't read the whole thing. What does it mean to be close? To host space, to trace shape, to pierce time, to find a vulnerability in the way that we carry mass, understand depth and volume, submerge, emerge into, out of the urge to curve and distort the line, to find a balance in an off-centeredness that is neither this nor that, here nor there, where there is and here is not, and not is the generative essence of nothing, where no thing resides, and thingliness lies in the eyes of those who would behold, and in the minds of those being beholden in this world, but not of this world. As this world turns and you become aware of the boundaries and borders and boxes and cages that rage against the machine. Maybe I'll do one more. Yeah, I'll do this one. Whatever happened to the, oh, I just forgot it. Oh, here it goes. Where's the proof that we should overcome? Living captive dreams, and I still feel the hum of bullwhip tips parting red seas, bodies screaming, and my back bleeds. Pecan trees and watermelon seeds that need to be felt from the inside and not hide behind pride or prejudice. Where is this road to redemption that doesn't have the dimensions of my world closing in? And when will we be free to be he, to be she, to be they, to be we? I said, when will we be free to be he, to be she, to be they, to be we? Free from all this civilized captivity, this feeling of uncertainty, these lost directions, and these false perceptions of who they think we're supposed to be. He is not me, and me is not he. This he that I be he, me, he, be. He is not me, and he is that me. This he that I be he, me, he, be.
Thank you so much. And I'm really, so I'm really interested in the character work, and you know, and you are, of course, you're a dance teacher, dance professor, and you work on stage, you work in the studio, but I know that that writing and reading are like essential parts of your practice. So I'd love to hear a little bit about that, the connection or the way in which this work, exists here on the page or, in voice, and then what you see as its evolution or as its continuation in other forms, or if you do.
Great, thank you. Yeah, for a long time, writing and a kind of theatrics have always been a part of my work from the very beginning. Lately, I've been really interested in a lot of visual art, and so a lot of visual artists have been really inspiring me. This particular work began with Carol Walker's silhouette work that she had been doing, and there was this part of me that wanted to capture a similar thing that had a very basic and simple form of just black and white, but it was so much more fuller and complicated and just rich with other information in the middle of it as you were watching it. And so I wanted to create a work around that. So I thought, what if I was living in a Black world where everything was Black? And so I started to kind of create costumes that were wrapped around using Black materials in different ways. That really just kind of working with trying to work with gender and also character. And there's a jacket that I'm trying to build that has these projectiles that is really geared towards the person that is talking about deflecting the bullets. And so I'm trying to kind of build a world that could hold not only the form, but also all of the expression and life of it all. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, well, and so then can you speak to the characters in that world? Because that definitely feels like a way of world making, right? With these different voices.
I think this this journey, this particular work, I am going to premiere. The full title of the work is called "Vegan Chitlins and the Artist Formerly Known as the N-Word," and I am going through a journey of talking about Blackness and what Blackness is. I think through all of the media information always seems to kind of put Blackness in these negative lights. And a part of me wanted to discover who those people were, who the Black families and really bring them to the space, you know. It began with the young men that had been shot by police officers. And somehow I felt like their story was my story. And even though I was still surviving, I felt there was this survivor's remorse in a certain kind of way that I was living and they weren't. And so I wanted to kind of honor them. Also honoring me and honoring my Blackness and the things that were important to me that I felt like, you know, really spoke to who I was, am, and will be. So I guess all the characters are really just kind of I would say a layering of different people at different times. There's sometimes I'm my father, sometimes I pull in Fred Moulton because I did a lot of reading, and one of the things that I'm working on is this idea of embodied language. And how do you embody somebody else's words or somebody else's language on you that in a way that allows it to feel like it's yours?
Yeah.
And so I was really interested in seeing if I could write like Fred, and if I could write like Sadia, if I could write like all of these people that I was really impressed with. And so that's what it led to the writing part of it. Yes.
Yeah. So what did you, so in attempting that, what did you uncover? Like, what did you discover in that attempt?
I discovered that I didn't really know what Blackness was.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. I discovered that every time I got to something that I felt like I thought was Blackness, it started to feel more performative instead of a kind of, yeah, it just started to feel like, oh, that you don't, that's not necessarily a tie to Blackness. It's just something that has happened or we see often. And so a part of me was really just trying to deal with that, you know. There are certain things, like even using the N-word. I was watching Paul Mooney, and, you know, if anybody knows Paul Mooney, uses the N-word a lot. And so at one point I was like, oh my gosh, like, at first I was laughing, and then it was like, oh, this is bothering me a little bit. I don't know why it's bothering me, because I'm not that person.
Right.
And so then I thought to myself, well, where is the barometer for how many times you can say the N-word before people start to get annoyed? And so there is a part of the text that I didn't do here that is that, where I go through a whole like N-word rant that I feel like kind of speaks to what I'm trying to do with this conversation.
Yeah. And so in the, like, in reciting that rant, or do you feel like you are reaching toward, or that the nature of Blackness, you know, if you're saying you've encountered a place where you're not sure what it is, are you approaching through, you know, through these other voices? Where is it taking
Oh
you?
yes,
Yeah,
that's been really the thing. It's like
yeah,
really reading all of these other voices, you start to realize like, oh, Blackness is a lot of things.
right,
like it's everything, you
yeah,
know, everything and nothing, you
right,
know. And so I think on some level, I learned that we don't have to define Blackness, you know, and that's what I'm really learning is that
mm,
everybody's life is valued.
yeah,
Doesn't matter who you are, your life should be valued. It doesn't matter what you've done, your life should still be valued. And I think that that's really what I want to. It's a love letter to Black people and especially Black men of all types, you know.
yeah. It's beautiful. Um, okay, I was so into I do have these questions that I shared. So let's see. So thinking about maybe the project that you know that you already discussed in the lecture, that does seem to be kind of an ongoing, but what I mean, I guess we've touched on this for you individually, but what maybe more outward facing impacts are you seeing from this work?
Mm-hmm. Uh, One of the things that I've been developing, I started developing over the pandemic, was these kind of ritual meditation practices that
Yes.
I called emancipatory practices. It started during the pandemic where I was sitting around and I was listening to sound frequencies to just kind of calm myself. It was really beautiful and wonderful, but then I started to really sink into the couch. And I was like, oh, I don't really know if this is where I want to go. And so I started to be like, okay, I got to get up and move. But I didn't really want to move a lot because I feel like with dancers, we move a lot.
Mhm.
So I started with stillness. And at the time, I was also reading a lot about Harriet Jacobs and Anthony Burns and Henry Box Brown, who all were using stillness to liberate themselves.
Mm.
You know, they were all fugitives running towards their freedom. And they were using stillness to liberate themselves. Harriet Jacobs was in the crawl space of a house where she was there for, I think, 7 years. I might be having that wrong.
Mhm.
But Henry Box Brown mailed himself to Philadelphia, and then Harry Burns was in the hull of a ship.
Mhm.
And so stillness became my first practice. And I developed a whole series of stillness um, postures. And through those postures, we're also listening to the frequency and we're holding them for duration. And through that process, I learned that through stillness, there is deep listening happening. And even though our bodies are not completely still, we're listening to what our bodies need. And that was really profound for me. And so I started to kind of come up with other ones. I have stillness, I have silence, submerge, emerge that you heard in the text is one of them, balance is another. And so I'm using all of these, and some of the people that I'm working with are Dr. Gaynell Sherrod is helping me out with a lot of historical information. I have Professor Wesley Taylor that's also a part of this project, and it's helping him out with sonic kind of elements to it. And my friend Rebecca Sten, who is a visual artist who has done a lot of, and dancer who did a lot of visual art. I've been in conversation with her about using some of her art, but removing the color and only having it be black and white. And we've had an incredible discussion about that, you know, just what it means to remove the color of a thing. And so that's what I also was going to show, a little bit of some of her artwork, but yeah. So I think all of these things are leading me in these other places with other dialogues of other people. And I think that's what the project has always been. At first, it was all Black men that I wanted to dialogue with, but then I was like, well, why limit yourself? Just dialogue with people about this, you know?
Yeah. And then in that, new insights emerge for you as you're accumulating in the practice. Yeah, and I should say that the emancipatory practice, in my mind, I want to do a project called the 1111 Project, where I have 11 participants. They go through all 11 emancipatory practices. We do it for an hour and 11 minutes. An hour is the actual embodied practice, and 11 minutes is a writing part of the practice over 11 days. And so I'm interested in really kind of developing it and putting it out there in the world in some way. And then the extra project is to expand these practices and send them out to other people to also write about stillness and write about silence and write about all these other from their perspective. Yeah. I'm so fascinated by by stillness as an avenue for a dancer, like for, you know, of this really profound discovery. And as liberatory, because it's easy to think about movement as liberation, right? Or a practice, but a practice of stillness is the subtlety and the you know, the rigor of that. Emotional, mental, you know, and physical rigor is profound. Yeah.
And just recently I ran across this podcast where a guy was talking, he collects sound, and he made this statement that was just blew my mind a little bit, where he says, silence is not the absence of sound, it is the absence of noise. And I was like, yes, that's it.
Yeah.
You know, like when you're in silence, you can actually hear what's available to you.
Right.
You know,
right.
And I was like, yeah, I'm on the right track with some things. Yeah.
Yes, definitely. Yeah. Beautiful. Okay. So maybe could you speak a bit about how this work is informing your teaching, or how students will be, you know, intersecting with your research?
Totally. I mean, it's funny. I think, you know, I've always been one of the teachers that, you know, kind of moves themselves as far away from normative practices as I can. And so I often will bring things into the classroom and work with the students on them and just, you know, test it out, see how they feel about it. I've done the stillness practice with the students over the summer. Not the summer, over the pandemic. When we were remote, I did the practice with them. I've also done it with some other people on the outside. And I'll bring in a lot of text, and I started noticing in students' choreographic, they're starting to use a lot more text and words, and you know, they're really interested in that becoming a part of also their practice. I have a student that is a visual artist that has also been incorporating visual art into their work. So I think it's just a matter of, I like to model teaching as opposed to telling people what to do. I like to just show them, these are the things I'm working on, and you know, try them on if you want to, you know. And so they get a big kick out of just trying things.
Yeah, right. And so you're offering them pathways or tools rather than instruction, like direction, or
Right. There was the other day, one of the students asked, they were asking about wrong and right. And I was like, I will never tell you something's wrong or right. And so they were like, what? And I was like, no, that's not, I will always give you multiple options
Mhm.
because I think there are multiple options.
Yeah.
That's the mathematics in me, the math teacher in me.
Well, but that's counterintuitive, right? Because math teacher, you would think like, oh yeah, there's a right answer, but higher math, no, right? It's much more complicated. Yes. Yeah, fantastic. Okay, well, let's see. I feel like what we've been talking about is sort of where where your curiosity is pointing, but is there anything more you would want to say about sort of where you're looking ahead, or what other avenues might be opening for you in terms of your work?
I had a real freak out moment when I went to go see this one-man show that I was doing for research, and I was like, oh, this is a real like one-man show. Like it's like theater and acting and stuff. And I was like, wait, is that what I'm doing?
Ah,
And all of a sudden I was like, I can't do that. I'm not an actor. That's not what I do. I don't do that. And I started to freak out. And I was like, oh, maybe I should put more dance in it. But then I was like, okay, calm down. You're already doing the things that this person is also doing, you know? And so I think that that's the thing. I think I'm kind of opening myself up to seeing my writing not just being about my choreographic experience, but also looking at other types of writing, like, you know, plays and, you know,
yeah.
scenes and film.
Yeah. But I really I mean, I really have such a strong sense of your curiosity and your sort of like investigating, right, and pushing yourself into, to really, you're not like taking something that and elaborating on it, but you're really like, there's a seeking and an openness that it's really compelling to the way you're describing this practice and this work.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for that, because I'm really very happy with all the things that I'm researching right now. Like I'm so excited, and I think that's one of the things that I keep trying to tell the students is like, when you're curious and excited about the thing you're doing, it's just easy. You know, like you just get into it and you just start doing it. I was also telling a student, it's like, I'm not, you know, I don't sit at my computer in my office and do that. And, you know, I sit at a bar writing, you know, like I like to be in chaos in order to kind of focus in some way or another. And so I think, yeah, I'm also an artist. I am an artist of all art. I believe in all of the arts. I think they're all very important. I want to kind of touch all of them in some way or another. Some of the texts may be sung. I'm trying to see what parts of myself is a visual artist, what parts of myself is a musician, what part of myself is an actor, what parts of myself is a writer, and all of those things. Costume designer, you know.
That's beautiful. I think that's a good place to stop, because I feel
Totally.
like it's like all the directions are there's so much openness and so much excitement about what's to come. So thank you so much for sharing this work, Trey. It's really lovely to talk with you.
Thank you, Lee. I so appreciate this. And thank you all for this, you know, rewind. This was really wonderful. Thank you.
Great. All right. Well, take care and keep us posted.
All right. Take care.
Okay.
Bye.
Yeah. Bye-bye. All right. Thanks, everyone. And it was wonderful to have you with us for Research Rewind. I'm sure we will do more of these talks in future. And meantime, keep on doing your work. And thank you so much.